Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's March 11th, 2022 program, Redistricting Oregon Style, a very current and interesting topic. This is the 23rd program in our 2021-22 programming year. I'm Katie Piercy, and I'm the City Club President, and proud to be so. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and sponsors. You can become a member of the City Club at our website, cityclubofueugene.org. This program is live streamed to our YouTube channel and archived there and on our Facebook page. Our podcast is available wherever you listen to podcasts. Programs are broadcast on public radio station KLCC on Monday nights at 7. We have both business and in-kind sponsors. Our diamond sponsors are Kaiser Permanente, University of Oregon, Peace Health, and Lane Community College. And we get generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. Our format today includes a question and answer period with City Club members and non-members alike via live stream and text. The texting number to submit your question will appear at the bottom of your screen during the intermission and the Q&A segment. Speakers for today's program, we're proud to welcome for Redistricting Oregon Style, Jim Moore, independent analyst and political outreach director, Pacific University, Tom McCall Center for Civic Engagement. Biographical information on our speaker is available at our website, cityclubofueugene.org. I'd like to thank Sandra Bishop for coordinating today's program, and here she is to do the introductions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sandra Bishop. I'm a City Club of Eugene member since 1990 and a former City Club president. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker and a little bit about the topic. Our speaker is an expert in the political process, and he's also a historian. He's not an expert in keeping tabs on our local politics, so we may need to take some of his expertise, comments and observations, and apply it to some of our local situations. All the political boundaries in the state, from Congress on down to legislative and local jurisdictions, have the potential to be adjusted during this 10-year assessment of population shifts that we know as redistricting. Here in Oregon, there's a lot of excitement about the state gaining a new congressional district. Everyone that follows politics or understands how influential our long-term Congressperson Peter DeFazio has been is anticipating what's going to happen with Oregon's influence at the national level after such a transition. And this is only one of many small transitions. We're looking at state, we're looking at local, a lot of different things are going to change because of the redrawing of the political boundaries. In Congress, we'll have a new inexperienced representative taking the open congressional seat. And throughout Oregon, the districts will be configured with some very interesting consequences. Our speaker today, Jim Moore, teaches politics at Pacific University in Forest Grove. And I want to thank Jim for taking time in his busy schedule to be with us today. We were lucky to have Jim's insights on these issues that are coming up during the redistricting. Jim Moore is the political outreach director at Pacific University in the Tom McCall Center for Civic Engagement. Since 1990, many of you have probably heard and seen Jim as an independent political analyst in the Portland area. He's also the elections analyst for KATU television in Portland, and also an analyst for a Portland radio station. And he works closely with a number of regional outlets and newspapers and several national media enterprises. He's also working on a biography of Victor Atiyeh. Vic Atiyeh was Oregon's last Republican governor. He served from 1979 to 1987. And he broke some other barriers, which I will let Jim reveal in his book. Jim is a cephalogist as well, and I had to look into this. Cephology? That's very interesting. So it turns out that cephology is based on, it's in ancient Greek, the meaning is literally has to do with pebbles and divination. So in doing a little bit of research, I found out the Greeks voted by casting pebbles. So it's very interesting. We can see how each of our votes has the potential to, and actually does, influence matters of state. And when I was thinking about this, I also thought about the image of casting a pebble into a pond. The ripples or waves, depending on how large the pebble or stone is that's cast, those ripples emanate out and can change the political tide, as we saw in the 2016 election, more like a tsunami rather than a ripple in a small pond. And so with the changes in every election this year, those changes will very likely be amplified by how the redistricting was done. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jim Moore. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with all of you today, those of you in the room and those of you virtually out there. 2 years ago this weekend was when my university was saying, you know, our spring break's going to be longer. We're going to have to shut down and try to figure out how to do all this. And here we are 2 years later, still trying to figure out how to do all this. So welcome to all of you. Redistricting. So what I'm going to do is give you a bit of a context of it, a little bit of history, and then we'll look at Oregon this year, because Oregon this year is fascinating. Just to start out and kind of ruin some of the surprise, Oregon was actually the first state to get all of its redistricting done, even with all the challenges that happened in courts and things like that. We were leading the pack in the entire country in getting our redistricting done. So with all those challenges, we actually were more efficient than other places. So redistricting itself, it harkens back to the way Great Britain ran its government. But when the US Constitution was written, the US Constitution has right in it that every 10 years there's going to be a census. And from that census, they're going to allocate the number of seats that are available to states for the US House. And so when every state became a member of the United States, they echoed that. They also said, aha, this 10-year census, we'll do the same thing in our own states and allocate these seats. So we're allocating them by land. Remember, every state gets 2 senators, so that's by land. And then every state gets its portion of House members. That's also by land, the boundaries of the state. There are no rules that say you have to have actual districts in a state. The rules simply say you're going to get this many House members. But states pretty much early on decided that they would create districts. And so the districts have to equal more or less in population. And the states then put that into place for their own state legislatures on down to the city level, you know, where you draw districts for city councils and things like that. Now, the reason I focus on the fact that it's land is there are other countries that do not have just land as a basis for redistricting. They, for instance, look at one house in a national legislature or a state legislature might be for people who represent organizations. And those organizations aren't physically necessarily in a single place, but they also have representation. And so they would look every 10 years or whatever their cycle is and say, aha, who should be a member of the organizations group that sits in effect in a third house in our government that's out there. So the land is something that basically reflects what the reality was in the 1700s. We're still living with it here today, many, many, many years later. Now, when you do the divisions up by district, by population, also very early on, people figured out, aha, I can do this if I'm in power so that my political party will have an advantage with the way the districts are drawn. So every district can have equal population, but I can make it so that, for instance, more people of my party are in several districts and people of the opposition party are in fewer districts. And so we get the word gerrymandered. It comes from a governor back in the good old days, Elbridge Gerry, pronounced with a hard G, who led one of these efforts. You can go online and find the political cartoon that was made of it. It basically looks like a Greek person bird that's hulking over the state. The person who drew the cartoon thought Elbridge Gerry was being a bit unethical, but gerrymandering has been with us since the very beginning. And so the issues in states like Oregon and everywhere are, how do you deal with it? Do you deal with it? What are the impacts? All of those kinds of things. When we get to the 20th century, the big issues were not just political parties, but the big issues became race. And so there's a whole host of rules at the state level and at the national level on what you can take into account when you divide up your political entities into districts by population. Basically, race can be taken into account if you can show that the districts are basically there to exclude members of a race from having equal representation according to the population. So if you have, for instance, pretty common in a lot of southern states, a population of blacks that is, say, 30%, but the way the districts are set up basically says only about 10% of the seats in the legislature will go to black members, then the federal rules and federal courts have said you can adjust those districts based on race in order to get better representation for the members of that community. So race is in there. It has some pretty particular rules, but it can be taken into account. And the big thing then is political party. And everybody says, no, you can't take political party into account, but everybody always puts it in. And it becomes an issue, as it did in Oregon, is the new districts, are the new districts favoring one party or the other? It's not exactly subtle, but it doesn't break any of the rules that we have out there quite yet. But it raises a whole host of issues. So when we look at the issues when you create new districts, there's two main things to pay attention to. First of all, the districts will match whatever the decision is of the political entity. So for instance, in Oregon, the districts are determined by the legislature. It passes a law, it has to pass the Senate, it has to pass the House, and then it has to be signed off by the governor. So, and every state will have a slightly different take on how they do that, but every state will have that legitimacy to create the new boundaries, whatever they are. In a state like Oregon, it's actually fairly rare in the 20th and going into the 21st century that the governor and the legislature agree on what those lines are. So there's always a fallback in every state. In Oregon, the fallback for the state legislative districts is it goes to the Secretary of State to make the decisions. For the congressional districts, it used to go to federal judge, but now we have a panel of judges that basically looks at the legitimacy of those congressional districts. But every state will have that. Now, when you do this, the assumption by the people who set up the boundaries is that we have basically cemented in our advantage, which you may or may not have, and the reason is very simple. Demographics change. People move into districts, people move out of districts. And so we'll get to a bit of data from Oregon here in a bit. If you're in a place where the population is changing rapidly, when you set up that district in the beginning of a decade, by 2 or 3 election cycles in, the demographics may have changed, so what you assumed would happen isn't happening anymore. That could be party change, it can be different ethnicities moving in or out, all those kinds of things. So there's an assumption that these kind of lock things in, but when demographic change happens rapidly, things can change, and what you assumed would happen doesn't happen. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So with all of this, with the political nature of setting up these districts, a lot of states, and this goes back in big time about 20, 25 years, have thought we need to set up a non-political way to set up the districts. And so a lot of them have come up with commissions. And the commissions are supposed to be nonpartisan. They make decisions that are binding, and everybody in the political world has to live with them. There are over 25 of them in the United States now, but what we discovered in this particular redistricting cycle that we're in right now, more than half of them have built-in politics into them, and they're actually failing and actually favoring one party over another. or they can be vetoed by the people who sit in positions of power who want their map to be in there instead of someone else's map. So the commission system is a great idea, but getting it right is really, really difficult. To keep in mind, here in Oregon, we do not have a commission system. There have been several efforts to get one before the people. They have a hard time getting signatures for a variety of reasons. I assume that we're going to see one of these commissions come before us as a ballot measure, because the legislature certainly isn't going to create it. They're the ones in the cat seat right now making the boundaries. So watch for that to come down the pike, but it's got to be done right, or it just is another form of partisan power as we look at things. Okay, now, one more thing before we get to Oregon stuff. Fascinating bit of analysis in the New York Times just this morning. They've looked at the redistricting going on for Congress across the country, and they have found that the Republican states that are basically gerrymandering, so Republicans will win more congressional seats, are almost exactly balanced by Democratic states like New York that are gerrymandering to get more Democrats in. So their estimate at the New York Times right now is that the kind of built-in states and congressional seats across the country are going to be about 216 to 218 for both parties. 218 is a majority. It basically means kind of the way the districts are set up, we may have a perfectly even split between Republicans and Democrats built into the system. That'll change as demographics shift because of incumbency and a variety of other things. But what we thought would be a tremendous Republican advantage with redistricting this year turns out to be almost an exact wash as we're looking at it right now. So just it's a fascinating set of puzzles. All 50 states doing this, they don't coordinate. It gets really strange out there. So let's go to Oregon. So Oregon, once again, you got to pass the law, and it's pretty common for the governor and the legislature to disagree, even if they're of the same party. Even if they're the same party. That did not happen 10 years ago, and it did not happen this year, where they agreed and the legislative maps became the actual districts that we have. In 2021, we had a fascinating mix of things. First of all, in the last 10 years, our demographics shifted a lot, and especially among voters. So remember, the census is whoever lives there, but the political world wants to look at who's registered to vote and then what party they are and if they turn out and all those other kinds of things. So 10 years ago, if we look at Oregon elections, Oregon registered voters, about 41.5% of registered voters were Democrats, about 32% were registered Republicans, and unaffiliated voters were about 20.5%. So there were Democrats, more or less 10% less, Republicans, more or less 10% less unaffiliated. Here we are 10 years later, and the unaffiliated have gone from 20.5% to 33.5% of all registered voters. That group has expanded dramatically. Republicans went from 32% down to about 25% of registered voters. Democrats went from 41.5% down to about 35% of registered voters. There's change happening out there. The real numbers are startling. The number of Democrats increased by 166,000. The number of Republicans increased by 67,000. That's almost a 3-to-1, definitely a 2.5-to-1 margin of Democrats increasing more quickly than Republicans. The number of unaffiliated voters went up by 560,000, dwarfs the other two. In fact, if you take out the Republicans from that 565,000 of unaffiliated, you'd only go down to 500,000. The Republicans are almost a rounding error when you look at the size of the increase of the number of unaffiliated voters that have come into the system in the last decade. So here's the problem Oregon faced. How do you make districts that take into account the unaffiliated voters. The second big problem Oregon faces is if you take out the unaffiliated voters and the 7% of everybody else who's registered as a minor party, and you just look at Democrats and Republicans, it's about 60% Democrats and about 40% Republicans. And you know what? When you look at our legislature, it's about 60% Democrats and about 40% Republicans. It looks like our legislature pretty much matches the way our party registration is if we take out all of those unaffiliated voters. But Republicans are going through a time of change, and they're trying to figure out, are they what they call a rural party? Are they a suburban party? Who are they? And the leadership has decided that they're more rural than not. Here's what happens when you look at the map of Oregon. 50% of all Republicans live in the Portland metropolitan 3 counties in Marion County and Lane County. Those 5 counties have 50% of all the Republicans in the state. About 40% of all Republicans live just in the Portland metropolitan area. But Democrats way outnumber them in the Portland metropolitan area and are doing pretty well against them in Lane County. Marion County, it's pretty much even. So how do you draw districts that give representation to where the bulk of Republicans are living in these larger population counties, but in places where there are so many more Democrats that you couldn't gerrymander a district that would have more Republicans in it, because Republicans and Democrats all live together. They're all mixed up. So that's a big problem. How do you solve that? So it went to the legislature, and the Republicans said, aha, we've got a solution. And the Democrats said, we have a solution. And the Republican solution was pretty simple. We want to oversample so that our 40% in registered voters is actually 50% plus in terms of representation. And Republicans or Democrats looked at it and said, aha, we want to oversample so that our 60%, when you look at it, we actually get about 65 to 70% representation. So they both wanted to oversample. To make all this even more fun, we had a Census Bureau that wasn't functioning very well because of COVID, and because the Trump administration decided it wanted to change the way the Census Bureau actually worked, how it counted people, how it gave its results. A second thing, which is fascinating and really fun to play with, there's now easily available software so people like you and me can go and do our own redistricting. In fact, the state of Oregon, the legislature put the software, actual software they were using, available for anybody online. You could use it, you could come up with districts, you could submit it to say, hey, here's my idea, take it into account. Let's see what happens. So we had challenges to actually counting things, and then we had more public access than we've ever had to what the district boundaries ought to actually look like. So the net result in Oregon, we did not have any neutral proposals. We had a Republican one and a Democratic one. The Republican one seemed to be, to me, the more egregious one, because they were asking for a lot more than their representation would suggest. But it also wasn't going to go anywhere because the Republicans don't have the majority in either house, and the Republicans don't have the governorship. And so the Democrats came up with theirs. That's fine. It was challenged, and the challenges on the congressional side were fascinating. So we got this new district. We got a sixth district, first time in 40 years, and about every 40 years is when we get a district. And so there was a lot made out of one of the districts that was redrawn. So it went from the southern Portland suburbs down into the Willamette Valley, over the Cascades to Bend. And so there was a Republican suit filed against that. And one of the main arguments it talked about was, in the winter, it'll be hard for that district to be One, because you can't get over the mountains all the time in the winter. And I looked at that and thought, well, that's a very interesting argument. First of all, it seems to me it was a slap in the face to Les Schwab, the tire company, which has made its fortune in getting people tires so they can get over the mountains in the winter. But secondly, Oregon has had, during its long time as a state, it's had congressional districts that cross over the mountains for more than half of those decades. There's been one for the last several elections, several decades we've been. It's the second congressional district. All of Eastern Oregon crosses the Cascades, goes over to Oregon, goes to Grants Pass. It's still doing that with the new map. A second thing that really jumped out to me was the person who filed the suit was a guy named Sean Lindsay. Sean used to serve in the state legislature. When he was there in 2011, he was one of the co-authors of the map at that point that was approved by the legislature and then signed by the governor. And one of the districts that Sean was quite happy to have in there was a House district in Southern Oregon that goes from the Medford suburbs over the Cascades and went out to Lakeview. And then it was redone, so it kept all of that and then went up towards Bend. So apparently in the southern part of the state, it's okay to have districts that cross the Cascades, but not in the northern part of the state. It made no sense to me whatsoever. When it went to the court system, the federal judges actually appointed somebody to be what they call a master to hear debate on all this and make decisions. And they looked at all that and said, you know, the Democrats, yeah, did fudge things in the new map, but they didn't fudge them enough that they broke Oregon law. And so we're keeping the new map. And that happened with the state legislative districts as well. Okay, so what do we have now? We have 6 congressional districts. One of them is basically guaranteed Republican. 2 of them are basically guaranteed Democrat. And the other 3 lean to Democrat. So instead of what we ought to have if it was more neutral, which would be 4 Democratic districts and 2 Republican districts, we're going to have 5 and 1 most likely. We got elections coming up. These are new districts. So we'll see how it all plays out. But just counting the number of registered voters in the districts, that's what it looks like. Remember, the Republican proposal would have given them 3 congressional districts to 3 Democratic districts. So way overrepresented them. Democrats overrepresent themselves. That's where we are. In the legislature itself, it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on because the Secretary of State has not updated the actual registration numbers for the new districts yet. We have some of them, but we don't have all of them. They're not on the Secretary of State's page where you can kind of download them all and say, oh, there we go. I can do the math. We can figure it out. But it looks to me like the state legislature is not going to move much just in terms of Democrats and Republicans. Just overall, there is over 1/3 of the seats in the House will actually be new people, and that's the best time for the opposition party to win seats when there's no incumbent. The Senate, we're getting close to that 30% number of people who are running for other things or not going to run for re-election. So there's a lot of opportunity here for Republicans, but it looks to me just at first glance like that the Republicans are still going to be in the minority, Democrats are still going to be in the majority, which matches the registration numbers across the entire state. Okay. Now, you and Eugene are at the point where you're looking at the local boundaries, and I'm up here in Washington County. We're looking at local boundaries as well. Those are beginning to shift and change. Washington County, where I am, has been one of the fastest growing parts of the state, it and Deschutes County with the Bend area. And the boundaries here are changing pretty radically because population has been the growth has been so strong up here. And so we'll see how that all plays out. But once again, the lines, even at the local level up here, look like they're not going to change who sits on city councils or who sits on county commissions, those kinds of things. So we've gotten through all of this. Is it fair? No. Are there better ways to do it? Yes. Are they easy to implement? Heck no. Are people going to pay attention to this next year? No, they aren't. People forget this until it comes up again when we have the next census. Okay? So the Oregon Way of Redistricting kind of looks like the partisan way that other parts of the country do, not quite as bad as states like Texas or New York, but whoever the majority party is uses their advantage. And that's been the way it has been forever here in Oregon. The ideas for going to something like a nonpartisan commission are out there, but they really haven't gotten beyond the idea stage to going out and saying, let's actually implement something, a ballot measure or whatever it takes to get these to go before the people. And so that's where we sit. That's where we sit. Oregon doesn't look that different from the rest of the country. One last thing to leave you with, because you're in Peter DeFazio country. When the Trump administration delayed things and COVID delayed things and the numbers were finally released to the states, there was an opportunity, especially in the Oregon House, because a deal had been made with the Speaker of the House at the time, Tina Kotek. She said, our redistricting committee will be half Republicans and half Democrats. We're not going to give the edge to the Democrats, even though they have the majority. And so there was a chance that we could have gotten a fairly neutral congressional map out of that committee, probably along the lines of 2 Republican seats to 4 Democratic seats. And if you want to ask in the questions, I even have a good idea where that Republican seat would have gone. But what happened was, as we started pushing on that, it quickly became clear that the Republicans' response was not going to be, oh, let's come up with a neutral map. They both went into their partisan corners and they said, Republicans, we want strong overrepresentation. Democrats, we want strong overrepresentation. And the Democrats won the fight. At the national level, this is where Peter DeFazio comes in, both Peter DeFazio and Kurt Schrader from the district north of you very clearly said that they favored a 5-to-1 map. And the reason they favored it was very clear. They're looking at a narrow Democratic majority in the House of Representatives right now. And they didn't want Oregon, in effect, to give up one of those Democratic seats with our new 6th district or the way new borders were. So they said, keep it strong Democrat, because that's the only way that we stay in the majority back here in Washington, D.C. So there was a collision of interest between the national representatives and the state representatives, and the national representatives won that argument. The Democrats in the Oregon legislature, especially the Oregon House, said, yep, we agree with that. We're going to draw the maps that favor Democrats. So just a fascinating political sciencey thing, collision between the representatives at 2 different levels. Okay, so with that, let's open it up for questions. We take a break here and come back. Is that the way it works?
So we're going to take about 5 minutes now, and we'll be back for questions and answers.
Hello, this is City Club of Eugene. We're in the Redistricting Oregon style program today. My name is Sandra Bishop. I'm a City Club member and helped to coordinate this program today. We're going to open the floor to questions from people that are here, and then we'll just continue with the Q&A. So we have our first questioner. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sandra. Hi, Professor. I'm Marty Wilde. I'm a state representative here in Oregon. Kind of what I saw, just to maybe put a little more nuance on the redistricting conversation here, is once the decision was made to have a 5-1 Democratic map, the Republicans decided to walk out to avoid passing that map, since it would go otherwise to a panel of judges who they thought they get a fair map for. And in return, the threat was, well, then we will allow the Secretary of State to gerrymander your seats on the state redistricting map. So in the end, it seemed like the Republicans decided to accept the gerrymandered federal map in exchange for a incumbent protection gerrymander at the state legislative level. So I was just curious, maybe you could talk a little about incumbency protection and the reasons a legislature might want to avoid having swing seats. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great, and it gets into kind of inside baseball, but the dynamics in a legislature when they're going through this are just fascinating to watch. Yeah, you're exactly right. The Republicans basically eventually decided we would rather trust the legislative map rather than having it go to our Secretary of State, who we think is too partisan, and so we just want to avoid that. And remember, back in Oregon, when we've had Secretary of State races, they're always just before one of these decennial censuses. And so sometimes, as happened 10 years ago and 20 years ago a little bit, that becomes an issue in a Secretary of State's race. Oh, you want this person to win because they're going to have to make the decision because the legislature won't be able to make it. I think the Republicans were right in their assessment. I don't know what Shamia Fagan's map would have looked like. In the past, the Secretaries of State have actually been fairly close with some tinkering to what the legislature did. The only one 20 years ago, Bill Bradbury, the map ended up being more or less the same. He renumbered every single district and kind of ticked us off who watched this, because we weren't able to talk about where districts were by number anymore. But in terms of incumbency protection, yes, it is a big problem. It's been a big problem since the beginning of this entire process 230 years ago. And it comes down to, where do those boundaries go? Do you punish somebody by moving the boundary slightly out of where their domicile is? Do you reward somebody by saying, aha, we're going to make it so that somebody who might challenge you is no longer in your district? Do you put a challenge, and this is pretty common when the majority party draws districts, that the minority party will win, put 2 incumbents from the minority party in that district so they'll have to run against each other. It's despicable, it's politics, it happens. That's why the commission idea is good. It won't get rid of these problems all the way, though, because people will always have a house that is slightly out of the district or in the district. But the idea with the commission form is that it will be done not to keep incumbents in place, but to put some kind of a reasonable grid of equal population districts on top of the population so that we get representation that matches who we are as a people. But it's really, really tough to do. It doesn't get rid of the problem of people in effect being forced to run in a district where they haven't been living in a long time, but the motivation is different. I don't know if that'll make a difference to voters. As I said at the end, most voters aren't going to remember that this was an issue a year from now. But for people in the political world, motivation often is very, very important. It's a tough nut to crack. It's a real tough nut to crack.
Thank you. Next questioner, Joel, go ahead.
Joel Corin, City Club member for about 10 years. Professor, to what do you attribute the 500,000 person increase in independent voters, and do you anticipate that they will split basically 60-40 also?
Yeah, no, great question. So we have been seeing this in Oregon, this phenomenon, since the early to mid 1990s. By the mid 1990s, of everybody who is registering to vote, half of them would register as unaffiliated and the other half would split evenly between Republicans and Democrats. Clearly that's way out of balance now, and most people are doing unaffiliated. So there's a couple things going on. First of all, people are frustrated with the political parties, and so they don't want to have an R or a D by their name. And they're also not registering for the minor parties. We're not getting a huge rush of libertarians. Remember, Oregon has independent is actually a party, a capital I independent, not getting a rush of people registering for independence or anything like that. And that really dates back to, we can see the trend goes back to Watergate. Watergate happened, people in both political parties began to lose faith in the parties, the number of unaffiliated voters began to grow. You can look at Oregon data, you can just see it happening by the kind of early 1980s. We see a definite bulge of unaffiliateds, and it just kept going. But the second thing, and what's accelerated, is motor voter. The fact that you now register to vote by simply going and getting your license or a state ID at the DMV. Oh, it's not the DMV anymore. I can't remember what it's called, but the motor vehicle place. And then you're automatically registered to vote. We have made it so that if you want to register for a party, you can't do it when you're there getting your ID. You have to send in a separate postcard. And that seems to have raised the difficulty level, so people aren't doing that. And that made the number of unaffiliated voters, which was already going up, it just accelerated the curve. It accelerated the curve. How do unaffiliated voters vote? The evidence suggests, and pretty strongly, that we actually clump ourselves with more like-minded political people than not. And this is a nationwide phenomenon. I don't know if you heard, there was a story on Oregon Public Broadcasting that ran in some of the newspapers. People in Idaho, realtors in Idaho are advertising for conservatives in the coastal states to move to Idaho. You'll be surrounded by people who are conservative like you. And we're doing that naturally. And so in Oregon, when we look at everything where there's political parties, so basically state legislature, Congress, and going for statewide office, when you look at the unaffiliated voters, they break almost exactly like the registered voters in a district. So if your registered voters are a 10% lead for Republicans, the unaffiliated votes, when we see them actually vote for people, break about 10% for Republicans. Okay, and so far it doesn't seem to be making that big a difference, except there's one crucial thing. When we look at turnout in voting, so for instance, the election we had in 2020, Republicans and Democrats both were over 90% turnout. Stunning, great. I'm a political science person. Turnout is fantastic. That's where you get a real sense of of what the polity wants. Among unaffiliated voters, it was in the mid 60s. It was 25% lower. So clearly the unaffiliated voters are less motivated to vote. Now remember, 65% turnout, if this were in any other state, people would be saying, hallelujah, we've got huge turnout. In Oregon, it doesn't look that great. But that's the big thing. Are we creating, in effect, a large group of unaffiliated voters who will break whatever the natural break is in whatever their district is, but they take part at a lower level? We're not sure what that means for our political system and for representation as we move forward. But that trend is going to continue.
Thank you. That was great. Our next questioner.
Hi, I'm Mary Layton, City Club member, and my question is about the commission, the Citizens Commission process. You said 25 states or something like that have tried some variations on it, which means there's been some kind of learning curve for people paying attention. Do you have any ideas about what improvements, how it might work if it were done effectively?
Yeah. The trick is it's got to have some connection to the political system, which is partisan. So how do you make that safe and in effect put a fail-safe breaker in there to make it work? We have an example of that. We have the Oregon Ethics Commission, where people are appointed by different partisan players, and then there's kind of an independent one who's in there. And that has worked pretty well. You know, there's ups and downs with it, but it's worked pretty well. But when you look at it, it has to be something that is representative of whatever it is you're trying to get. So a lot of the commissions say, we need X number of members of the commission from each congressional district in our state, okay? And then how do you get the representation beyond that? So in a lot of states, they'll say, oh, we have ethnicity issues. So we need a certain number of people who are Latino voters, or a certain number of people who are Asian voters, or whatever it is. A number of other states have made it very clear that gender is very important. And so they'll have a commission where the gender is 50-50. We don't have any state where the gender is that far out of whack that you would short one gender or the other. But it's whatever you decide. But then the accountability is the problem. So how do you get the political system to say, okay, we agree that this is who can serve on it, and we'll keep our fingers off of that process, which has been really hard in a lot of states. And then once they report out, how much power do they have to say, this is the answer, you politicos don't get to muck around with it, which has been a problem in about 1/3 of the states. Like the final commission will say, yeah, here's the solution, and the governor will say, no, I'm not going to accept that. And so those are really tough things. In Oregon, I've seen a couple of commission systems that do a pretty good job of putting these fail safes in there, putting where the political and this commission mesh together so that it worked pretty well. I've seen others that have basically said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to basically wake the commission. And the most common thing is to make it so that Portland is less represented than its huge population would justify. Because if you're in the rest of the state, why should Portland get to have all the say? Well, it's because we're the people. That's where the people live. Now, I don't live in Portland, but I live in the Portland area. And you know, it's hard for people in the state to get their heads around the fact, and in any state, that the districts are even by population. I have so many, I grew up in Southern Oregon, and talking to people in Southern Oregon and Eastern Oregon, there's so many of them who say, but look, when you look at the map, it's all red. How come we don't win? It's because the map is showing geography, and that's not how you vote. You vote by population. If we were to change it, it'd be a small red and a bigger blue because the population is living in a smaller geographic area. And so those kinds of things are hard to overcome in people's perceptions, and then putting together so you have a legitimacy with the commission. But I think there are some good models out there. There's several good government groups that are out there. Common Cause is really involved in this. And I have faith that they and like the League of Women Voters will come up with something that works, that can get out there. But there's also going to be people who want to have a commission that will favor whatever they want to favor. So we have to sort that out. That's what we the people have to do.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about the drawing of the lines, and there were some questions submitted ahead of time that have to do with how are jurisdictions sure that the candidates that are running are actually within those boundaries. So there's been several, well, you probably know, high-profile instances, especially of individuals running for the state legislature where it was found, oh, by the way, this person doesn't live in this area. And it seems like the higher profile, or the more important, quote, important the race, the more enforcement there is of such things. But almost every election cycle, there are people who file and get through the candidate process. They're running against someone, but they don't actually live in that district that they're running for. Usually it's just let go because it's an insignificant candidate who's not going to prevail or not even going to show up, especially if it's a primary, you know, that maybe get 1% of the vote or something. But how strong are the protections under Oregon law that prevent individuals from running for office in a district in which they do not reside? And then there's a follow-up question with that. But
yeah, so the way that Oregon law works is we don't have a system that goes out and looks for and verifies that you actually live where you live. A complaint has to be filed. And the complaint, oddly enough, is usually filed by somebody from the other party who says, oh, that candidate doesn't actually live there. So very famous one from 25 years ago Wes Cooley, who eventually served one term in Congress, from Eastern Oregon. So did Wes actually live in his district or not? His mailing address was a almost derelict mobile home out in the middle of the desert at the end of a dirt road. And he loved to go motorbiking, but nobody thought he was hanging out there motorbiking in the middle of nowhere. And the final resolution was, well, the preponderance of evidence says he probably did live there, but then he ran for Congress and it became irrelevant. And so it's tough. Think about the ruling that our Secretary of State made on Nick Kristof. So it wasn't the boundary, it was simply how long he lived here and what constituted a domicile. What did that work? Oregon has never defined that in statute. It's been basically, oh, you complained, I'll look into it. And what Shemia Fagan argued was he registered to vote in New York. Registration to vote is what I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt to. And the Oregon Supreme Court unanimously said, yeah, we agree. That's what we'll argue as well. It's kind of the same thing when you get to where the boundaries are and those kinds of things. There's a case right now, a guy named Brad Witt, who serves in the legislature, lives up north of Portland. His district was rejiggered. He looked at it, he's a Democrat. He said, I can't win this. I'm not gonna run for re-election. He's been in for a long time. He just popped up just in the last couple of weeks. He's running for a district in Salem now. So has he moved? Oregon law says you have to live there for a year if you're gonna be a state legislator. How long has he been there? You know, all those questions will be open, but it's then up to someone to complain about it to get the process started. We don't have a system that looks and says, oh, Brad, you got to prove that you lived there and meet this high standard before we start.
Thank you. And so another related question, is it true that there is no requirement to live within the boundaries of the district to run for Congress?
Yes, the Constitution of the United States says you must be an inhabitant of the state. And some people have even looked at that and said, you know, you don't even have to be an inhabitant of the state if you read it a certain way. So up here in the Portland Congressional District, District 3 with Earl Blumenauer, 2 years ago, he was being challenged at one point by somebody from, I can't remember exactly where, but it was somebody from North Carolina or something. And because the Constitution says basically, by the time you're sworn in, you should pretty much be in that state. But before then, you don't have to live there. And so that's why, for instance, with the new 6th Congressional District, Loretta Smith, who's been a Multnomah County Commissioner and things up here in the Portland area, she said she was gonna run even before the district was defined. And she's in, and she doesn't live in the district, and she's on the ballot. And we can't change that at the state level because it's in the US Constitution.
Yes, it's very interesting. I think a lot of people did not realize you didn't have to live in the district to run for a congressional district, and most politicians in Oregon will certainly want to be within the district they're running from. So
exactly. We encountered this before also in the 1990s. We passed campaign finance limits. You can't pass campaign finance limits on people running for federal office because federal law is what they're under. We can't change that at the Oregon level.
Another question that had come in, which is kind of open-ended, but this may be, we just have maybe 1 to 2 minutes for you to answer this one, but what's the most unusual thing that you've seen come out of redistricting in the past in Oregon was the question.
I think, I mean, there's always the case where somebody is on the wrong side of a street, and then do they move? And I've seen state legislators, that it happens to state legislators, some of them say, well, I'm just done, or some of them immediately move to another place and they take care of that. That's fairly common. You know, I'm from Southern Oregon, and the Medford area is a problem in terms of determining the population of the state because too many people live there. And so the most unusual thing I have seen is what happens when a legislature tries to figure out, we're drawing congressional districts, what on earth do we do with Medford? So Medford has either been in a district with Eugene or in a district with Eastern Oregon. And so people from Medford rarely run for Congress and win because they're always, they're outnumbered by the Eugene people or by all the rest of the people in Eastern Oregon. One of the reasons I wear bow ties is a member of my church was a guy named John Dellenbach, who was a member of Congress in the 1970s. John was a great guy. He was in Congress. He was defeated by Eugene's Jim Weaver when we had elections and Medford shifted where it was and Watergate came along and that kind of stuff. And so just watching poor Medford basically be this major city, but an afterthought in all of this, and their population is never going to be big enough that they become a place people build an entire district around. So there you go.
Interesting, thank you. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Turns out we do have a couple more minutes. Is there anything that we didn't ask about or anything that you wanted to elaborate on out of this and what you're looking at currently as far as what are the next things that are likely to hit the news on this?
Yeah, so I think the key thing is this all has a whiff of corruption. It has a whiff of why people hate politics. It has a whiff of this just isn't right. The ethics don't look good. It is what our founding fathers intended. They wanted it to be messy so that states had to wrestle with all these kinds of things. And then it would encourage people to enter politics and look at the long run and all those kinds of things. The key thing, though, I think people need to keep in mind, especially in a state like Oregon, is you'll live in places where the demographics change. And so the farther you get from the new districts, so we have our first election now, the second one 2024, then 2026, 2028. By the time you get to 2028, there's going to be a lot of districts that don't match what the original intention was. We saw that in the Bend districts over the past several election cycles, because Bend has just exploded in population. So just keep that in mind. This is really important right now. By a couple of election cycles from now, it won't seem that important, and then there are going to be strains in the system, and we'll be saying, oh my gosh, when are we going to do this again so we can match things up again? And that messy, semi-corrupt political process is the way it was intended to run. I hope commissions can come in and change that, but right now the evidence on that is really, really mixed.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over back to our president for our closing remarks. Thank you again, Jim.
Thank you. This has been March 11th, 2022 program, Redistricting Oregon Style. Everything's different about Oregon, I guess. Before we thank our speakers today, I'd like to recognize our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high-quality, affordable health care services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information is available at www.kp.org. The University of Oregon has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically since 1876. Get more information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health has been proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond as your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years. The Peace Health mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. We are grateful for the generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. I would like to acknowledge our Ruby sponsor, Johnson, Johnson, Lucas, and Middleton. Support for the City Club comes from Johnson, Johnson, Lucas, and Middleton, a team of experienced, compassionate attorneys fighting for justice. If you have been seriously harmed by wrongdoing and need help, please contact us at justicelawyers.com. Our Sapphire sponsor, Bennett and Dean Real Estate. Support comes from Bennett and Dean Real Estate, a full-service real estate brokerage offering a comprehensive range of services for buying or selling a Lane County residence. For more information, visit bennettdean.com. Today's gold sponsor is Pacific Cascade Federal Credit Union. Thanks to you and to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing, LLC, and Dotson's Photography. And a special thank you to public radio station KLCC-FM for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and our podcast. We invite everyone, members and non-members, to participate in our programs in person at this venue, the First United Presbyterian Church at 1376 Olive, or by live stream on your YouTube page. More information is at our website, cityclubofeugene.org. So next week, we'll have a conversation with both candidates for the Eugene City Council Ward 4 race, incumbent Jennifer Ye and challenger Jennifer Solomon, the Battle of the Jennifers. Please join us and learn about who you want to vote for on March 18th. More details and information about future programs can be found online at the City Club's website, cityclubofeugene.org. And now I can see him. I was back here. I couldn't actually see your face, Jim, so I get to see you now. Hi. Anyway, thank you so much for a great program and a great discussion on something that's not only pertinent here, but pertinent across our nation. Thanks very much. This concludes today's program. Go out and enjoy the sunshine, everyone.